In the basement archives of the Harlan County Courthouse, beneath decades of coal dust and bureaucratic neglect, sits a leather-bound ledger marked only with faded ink. Family Court, Special File 3. The binding is cracked, the pages yellowed with age, but it's the penciled notation in the margin that stops you cold. Written in the careful script of a long-dead clerk, one word: unnatural. Inside are affidavits that read like fever dreams, photographs that capture moments never meant for public eyes, and sworn statements so scandalous they were sealed by court order for 90 years. This is the documented record of a marriage arrangement that violated every sacred principle of God-fearing Appalachian society, a twisted covenant that began in whispered promises and ended in blood on a frozen hillside. The file tells of two brothers who shared everything: their father's land, their mother's Bible, their reputation in the coal camps. But in the winter of 1934, they began sharing something else, something that would damn them all. What you're about to hear was buried for nearly a century, locked away in courthouse vaults and family shame. If you're ready to uncover the twisted truth that shocked even hardened mountain folk, a truth so disturbing it took a double murder to silence it, then subscribe and ring that bell, because some family secrets were meant to stay buried, but tonight we're digging them up. This is the story of the brothers who shared one wife. Eastern Kentucky, 1934. The coal fields stretch like black veins through the Cumberland Mountains, and in their shadow, communities cling to survival with calloused hands and stubborn pride. The Great Depression has settled over these hollows like morning fog, heavy, suffocating, and seemingly permanent. Here in towns with names like Evarts, Lynch, and Benham, families survive on subsistence farming, backwoods ingenuity, and the dangerous work of extracting coal from the earth's belly. Men descend into darkness before sunrise and emerge, if they're fortunate, by lamplight. Women tend gardens that refuse to grow in coal-poisoned soil and stretch every penny from the company store until it screams. But survival requires more than strong backs and empty stomachs. In these isolated communities, reputation is currency, and family honor is defended with the same intensity men reserve for protecting their minds from claim jumpers. The social fabric is woven tight. Presbyterian churches anchor every settlement. Gossip travels faster than bad news, and everyone knows everyone else's business 3 generations back. Marriage here is not merely a civil contract, but a sacred covenant witnessed by God, community, and mountain tradition. A man takes one wife, she bears his children, and together they weather poverty, sickness, and the particular brand of hardship that comes with scratching life from unforgiving stone. To break this covenant is sin enough, but to twist it, to corrupt it into something unrecognizable, that borders on blasphemy. The winter of 1933 had been particularly cruel. Coal prices dropped so low that mines shut down for weeks at a time, leaving families to survive on stored beans and whatever game the men could hunt in the frozen woods. It was during this season of desperation that outsiders began appearing in the hollows. Not revenuers or company men, but drifters seeking work, warmth, and a chance to disappear into communities that asked few questions. Among them was a woman who would change everything. In the mountain settlements clustered around Harlan County's coal operations, the Sullivan brothers had built a reputation for both reliability and peculiarity. Thomas, the elder by 3 years, possessed the kind of quiet strength that coal mining demanded. At 28, he stood 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorframe, his dark hair already showing premature gray from years underground. He spoke little, prayed often, and commanded respect through competence rather than bluster. When equipment broke down in the mines, Thomas fixed it. When younger miners needed guidance, Thomas provided it. When the mine foreman needed someone to work a dangerous shaft, Thomas volunteered. His brother Samuel presented a study in contrast. 25 years old, lean and quick-witted, Samuel possessed the kind of restless intelligence that found coal mining insufferable. While Thomas descended into the earth each morning, Samuel worked the surface, trading in information, favors, and the bootleg whiskey that kept mining camps functioning through long, brutal winters. He knew which county officials could be bought, which federal agents could be avoided, and which families would pay premium prices for corn liquor that didn't blind you. The brothers lived together in their father's cabin, a sturdy two-room structure their grandfather had built from hand-hewn chestnut logs. They shared meals, chores, and the comfortable silence of men who understood each other without words. Thomas would return from the mines blackened with coal dust, wash in the creek behind their cabin, and sit on the front porch reading scripture by lamplight. Samuel would count the day's earnings from his various enterprises, clean his rifle, and plan the next day's activities with the methodical precision of a military campaign. Their mother, dead these 5 years, had raised them to be God-fearing men who honored family above all else. Their father, killed in a mine collapse when Thomas was 22, had taught them that a man's word was his bond, and a family's reputation was worth more than money. Both brothers carried these lessons like inherited scars, deep, permanent, and occasionally painful. But it was their shared loneliness that made them vulnerable. Neither brother had married, though both had reached ages when mountain society expected sons to take wives and produce the next generation of miners and mothers. Thomas's reserved nature made courtship difficult. He possessed little talent for the kind of easy conversation that won women's attention. Samuel's reputation as a dealer in illegal goods made respectable families reluctant to offer their daughters, despite his obvious intelligence and steady income. So when she arrived in February of 1934, walking down the muddy main street of their settlement with a cardboard suitcase and eyes like storm clouds, both brothers noticed. Her name was Catherine Margaret Henley, though she told different people different versions of her story. To some, she was a widow from Virginia seeking work as a seamstress. To others, she was a school teacher whose position had been eliminated by budget cuts. To the Presbyterian minister, she was a devout Christian woman fleeing an abusive marriage. Each story contained just enough detail to sound plausible and just enough gaps to avoid verification. What couldn't be disputed was her effect on the community. Catherine stood perhaps 5.5 feet tall, with auburn hair that caught light like spun copper, and a figure that filled her simple dresses in ways that made married women uncomfortable and unmarried men forget their manners. She possessed an education evident in her precise speech and careful handwriting, carrying herself with a dignity that seemed almost aristocratic in settlements where most women had worked their hands raw by age 30. But it was her eyes that unsettled people most. Pale green, intelligent, and completely unreadable. She looked at men as if she could see through their pretenses to something deeper and more interesting. She looked at women as if she were cataloging their weaknesses. She looked at the rough mining town as if it were a temporary inconvenience rather than the end of the world. Thomas Sullivan first encountered Catherine on a Sunday morning in March when she appeared at Presbyterian services wearing a dark blue dress and a hat that had clearly cost more than most families spent on clothing in a year. She sat alone in the back pew, sang hymns in a clear soprano that made the congregation turn to stare, and listened to the minister's sermon with the kind of focused attention that made him preach longer and more passionately than usual. After services, as the congregation gathered outside to discuss the week's gossip and business, Thomas found himself standing near Catherine as she gazed across the valley toward the mine tipples and company houses. "It's beautiful country," she said without looking at him. "Harsh, but beautiful." Thomas, who had lived his entire life in these mountains without ever considering their beauty, found himself seeing them through her eyes. The way morning mist clung to the ridges, the way early wildflowers pushed through the coal-stained soil, the way the community of rough wooden buildings nestled into the landscape as if they had grown there naturally. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, his voice rusty from lack of use in social situations. "I suppose it is." She turned then, those storm cloud eyes studying his face with unsettling directness. "You're Thomas Sullivan, aren't you? I've heard you're the finest miner in the county." The compliment, delivered in her educated accent, made Thomas's neck flush with embarrassment and pleasure. "I do my work, ma'am. Nothing more." "Nothing more?" Catherine smiled, the expression that transformed her serious features into something luminous. "From what I hear, you do considerably more. You keep other men safe down there. That's no small thing." It was perhaps the longest conversation Thomas had held with an unmarried woman in 5 years, and it left him feeling as if he had discovered something precious and fragile that might disappear if he moved too quickly. Samuel's introduction to Catherine came 3 days later, under considerably different circumstances. He encountered her at McCready's general store, where she was examining bolts of fabric with the critical eye of someone who understood quality. Samuel had come to collect payment from McCready for a recent whiskey delivery, but found himself lingering near the dry goods counter, fascinated by the way Catherine's fingers moved across different materials, testing weight, checking weave, evaluating worth with professional expertise. "You're not from here," Samuel said, his approach more direct than his brother's careful courtesy. Catherine looked up from a bolt of blue cotton, one eyebrow raised at his presumption. "Is it that obvious? Around here, women buy fabric by necessity, not choice. You're shopping like someone who knows what things should cost." Samuel leaned against the counter with practiced ease. "I'm Samuel Sullivan. You met my brother Thomas at church Sunday." "Ah." Catherine's expression shifted, becoming more interested. "The other Sullivan brother. I'd heard there were two of you. What else have you heard? That you're the one to know if someone needs something that can't be bought at the company store?" Her voice carried no judgment, only pragmatic acknowledgement. Samuel found himself genuinely surprised. Most respectable women pretended ignorance about his various enterprises, even when they benefited from them. Catherine's directness was refreshing and dangerous in equal measure. "Depends on what someone needs," he replied carefully. "Right now, I need work. I can sew, keep books, teach children their letters. I can also keep my mouth shut about other people's business." Catherine folded the fabric and set it aside. "In my experience, that last skill is often the most valuable." It was an offer and a warning, delivered with the kind of calm confidence that made Samuel reconsider everything he thought he knew about school teachers and widows from Virginia. Within a week, Catherine had rented a room above the general store and begun taking in sewing work from the mining families. Her stitching was precise, her prices fair, and her ability to improve the appearance of worn clothing bordered on miraculous. More importantly, she proved Samuel's assessment correct. Catherine Henley knew how to keep secrets. When miners' wives brought her dresses that needed letting out to hide pregnancies they weren't ready to announce, Catherine sewed without asking questions. When the mine foreman's wife needed a torn dress mended without her husband learning she'd been visiting the bootlegger's cabin, Catherine provided discretion along with needle and thread. When young women needed undergarments that would help them catch husbands, Catherine offered both practical assistance and worldly advice. But it was her effect on the Sullivan brothers that began to worry the community. Thomas started bathing more frequently, scrubbing coal dust from his skin with the kind of thoroughness usually reserved for Sunday services. He purchased new shirts from the company store, traded his worn boots for a pair that actually matched, and began lingering after church to walk Catherine back to her lodgings. For a man who had previously treated social interaction as a necessary evil, Thomas's newfound attention to grooming and conversation marked a transformation that made neighbors take notice. Samuel's changes were more subtle but equally significant. His illegal enterprises had always operated with military precision, but now he seemed driven by something beyond mere profit. He expanded his network of contacts, took greater risks for higher returns, and began accumulating cash with the focused intensity of a man planning for something specific. He also started appearing at social gatherings he had previously avoided, always finding reasons to position himself near Catherine, while maintaining the appearance of casual interest. The triangle that formed between them was invisible to outsiders but painfully obvious to anyone who knew how to read the signs. Catherine treated both brothers with the same friendly respect, but observant women noticed how her conversation with Thomas focused on his work, his opinions, his plans for the future. With Samuel, she discussed books, asked about life beyond the mountains, and listened to his stories about the wider world with the attention of someone planning an escape. By April, when spring finally broke winter's grip on the mountains and wildflowers began pushing through the coal-stained soil, everyone in the settlement understood that Catherine Henley would soon become Catherine Sullivan. The only question was which brother would claim her. The answer came on a warm Sunday evening, when Thomas Sullivan appeared at Catherine's door carrying his mother's engagement ring. A simple gold band with a small diamond that had been passed down through 3 generations of Sullivan women. Catherine accepted his proposal with tears in her eyes and a kiss that made the old women watching from their porches remember what it felt like to be young and desired. But those same old women noticed something else that evening. something that made them pull their shawls tighter despite the warm air. As Thomas and Catherine stood together on the porch, lost in their private moment of joy, Samuel Sullivan watched from the shadows across the street. His face remained carefully neutral, but his hands were clenched into fists, and he stood perfectly still for nearly 10 minutes before disappearing into the darkness between the buildings. It was, they would later agree, the moment when everything began to go wrong. The brothers who shared one wife, sections 4 through 6. Dark chapters, buried truths of American history. The wedding took place on a Saturday in late May, when the dogwood trees bloomed white against the green mountainsides, and the air carried the promise of a summer that might actually bring prosperity back to the coalfields. Catherine wore a dress she had sewn herself from ivory silk that Samuel had somehow procured from Lexington, a luxury that raised eyebrows but was attributed to his mysterious business connections rather than anything more sinister. Thomas stood beside her at the altar of the small Presbyterian church, his usually stern face transformed by genuine happiness. He had shaved so carefully that morning that small cuts dotted his jaw, and his hands trembled slightly as he placed his mother's ring on Catherine's finger. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas kissed Catherine with the desperate tenderness of a man who had never expected to find love in a world that offered little beyond survival. Samuel served as best man, his smile never wavering throughout the ceremony. He shook his brother's hand with apparent warmth, kissed Catherine's cheek with brotherly affection, and made a toast at the small reception that brought tears to several women's eyes. To anyone watching, he appeared to be the devoted younger brother celebrating his siblings' good fortune. But Martha Combs, who had known the Sullivan family for 30 years, later swore that during the wedding ceremony, Samuel never once looked at his brother. His eyes remained fixed on Catherine throughout the entire service, watching her with the intensity of a man memorizing something precious that was about to be taken away. The newlyweds moved into the Sullivan cabin, and for the first month, the arrangement seemed to work well. Catherine transformed the rough bachelor quarters into something approaching a proper home, hanging curtains she had sewn from scraps, planting a small garden behind the cabin, and cooking meals that made Thomas hurry home from the mines with an eagerness he had never shown before. Samuel continued to live with them, sleeping in the small back room that had been his since childhood. The brothers had always shared everything, Catherine reasoned, and Samuel's various enterprises provided income that helped support the household. Besides, in mining communities where families often crowded multiple generations into single cabins, the arrangement was practical rather than unusual. But by midsummer, the whispers began. It started with small observations that, individually, meant nothing. Neighbors noticed how often Samuel was at the cabin during the day when Thomas worked underground. Mining shifts ran from dawn to dusk, leaving Samuel and Catherine alone together for long hours that stretched into something resembling intimacy. When asked about it directly, both had reasonable explanations. Samuel needed to conduct business from the cabin, using it as a base for his various enterprises. Catherine was teaching him to read better, helping him with the letters and numbers that his illegal activities required. But explanations couldn't account for everything people began to see. Ezra Morrison, who lived in the cabin closest to the Sullivans, swore he heard laughter coming from their kitchen window on Tuesday afternoons. Not the polite laughter of business associates, but the easy, unconscious laughter of people who enjoyed each other's company. When Thomas worked night shifts, which happened twice weekly, Morrison claimed he could see two figures moving around the main room of the cabin well past midnight, their shadows dancing across the curtained windows in what looked like intimate conversation. More troubling were the observations made at church and community gatherings. Catherine had always been reserved in public, maintaining the dignified demeanor expected of a miner's wife. But several women noticed that her composure slipped when Samuel spoke. She would lean forward slightly, her attention focusing on him with an intensity that seemed inappropriate for casual conversation. Once, during a church social, Eleanor McCready watched Catherine laugh at something Samuel whispered to her, then immediately look around to see if anyone had noticed, her face flushing with what appeared to be guilt. The most damning observation came from young Billy Watkins, who had been hunting rabbits in the woods behind the Sullivan cabin on a warm August evening. Billy later told his mother that he had seen Catherine and Samuel walking together by the creek, their voices too low to hear, but their posture unmistakably intimate. According to Billy, they stood closer together than any married woman should stand with her husband's brother, and when Catherine reached up to touch Samuel's face, it was with the tenderness of a wife rather than a sister-in-law. Billy's mother, Rebecca Watkins, tried to dismiss the story as childish imagination, but found herself watching the Sullivans more carefully during Sunday services. What she saw confirmed her growing suspicions. Catherine sat between the two brothers, but her attention drifted consistently toward Samuel. When the minister spoke about the sanctity of marriage, Catherine's eyes would find Samuel's, and some silent communication would pass between them that made Rebecca deeply uncomfortable. The breaking point came in September, during the annual harvest festival that marked the end of summer and the beginning of the long coal mining season. The entire community gathered in the field behind the church for an evening of music, dancing, and the kind of socializing that helped people endure the isolation of mountain winters. Catherine had spent weeks preparing for the festival, sewing a new dress from deep green fabric that complemented her auburn hair and made her pale eyes seem almost luminous in the lantern light. She moved through the crowd with Thomas, accepting congratulations on their marriage and compliments on her contribution to the community's social fabric. But as the evening progressed and corn liquor loosened tongues and inhibitions, the careful boundaries that had maintained the Sullivan household's respectability began to crumble. Samuel had been drinking steadily since the music began, not enough to appear drunk, but sufficient to make him careless about maintaining appearances. When the fiddler started a waltz, Thomas asked Catherine to dance, and they moved together with the awkward formality of people still learning to be married. Samuel watched from the edge of the crowd, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. When the dance ended and Thomas went to speak with other miners about work schedules, Samuel approached Catherine with the kind of casual confidence that alcohol provides. He offered his hand without asking permission, and Catherine accepted it without hesitation. They moved on to the makeshift dance floor as the fiddler began a slower, more intimate song. What happened next was witnessed by dozens of people, though their accounts varied in detail while agreeing on the essential facts. Samuel and Catherine danced closer together than convention allowed, their bodies moving with a familiarity that suggested previous practice. Catherine's hand rested on Samuel's shoulder in a way that seemed possessive rather than polite. Samuel looked down at her with an expression that several witnesses later described as hungry or desperate or simply wrong. Most damning of all, when the song ended and they should have separated, they remained in each other's arms for several heartbeats too long. Long enough for conversations to stop, long enough for other dancers to notice, long enough for Thomas Sullivan to see his wife and his brother holding each other in a way that violated every understanding of proper behavior. Thomas crossed the crowd with the deliberate stride of a man exercising tremendous self-control. He placed his hand on Samuel's shoulder, not roughly, but with enough pressure to make his message clear. Samuel released Catherine immediately, offered a casual comment about the music, and walked away as if nothing had happened. But the damage was done. The community had seen something that couldn't be unseen, and the questions that had been whispered privately were now impossible to ignore. The following weeks brought a subtle but unmistakable change in the way people interacted with the Sullivan household. Neighbors who had previously stopped by for casual visits now found reasons to avoid the cabin. Women who had brought Catherine into their social circles began excluding her from gatherings, citing scheduling conflicts or family obligations. Men who had worked alongside Thomas for years maintained their professional relationships but avoided personal conversation. The isolation was gradual but comprehensive, the kind of social exile that mountain communities imposed when someone violated unspoken but fundamental codes of behavior. The Sullivans were being quietly shunned, and everyone understood why without anyone having to say it directly. Thomas responded to the community's rejection by throwing himself into his work with even greater intensity. He volunteered for the most dangerous mining assignments, worked longer shifts than anyone else, and spent his evenings reading scripture with the desperate focus of a man seeking answers to questions he couldn't voice. Samuel's response was more complex. His various enterprises continued to operate efficiently, but he began traveling more frequently, disappearing for days at a time on business that took him far from the local community. When he was home, he maintained careful distance from Catherine, speaking to her only when necessary and never allowing himself to be alone with her. in ways that might fuel additional gossip. Catherine herself seemed to wither under the weight of community disapproval. The confident, vibrant woman who had arrived in February became increasingly withdrawn, spending her days sewing in silence and her evenings sitting on the cabin's front porch, staring across the valley with an expression of profound sadness. But appearances, as the community was about to learn, could be devastatingly deceptive. On the third Tuesday of October, when the leaves had turned brilliant red and gold and the first frost had killed Catherine's garden, Thomas Sullivan collapsed in the mine shaft during the afternoon shift. His fellow miners carried him to the surface, where he spent 20 minutes coughing up blood before recovering enough to walk home under his own power. The mine doctor, a company man with minimal training and maximum skepticism about workers' complaints, examined Thomas briefly and diagnosed exhaustion. He prescribed rest, better nutrition, and the kind of medical care that mining families couldn't afford. Thomas was told to take a week off work to recover his strength, but Thomas's condition didn't improve. If anything, it worsened. He developed a persistent cough that racked his body with spasms, lost weight despite Catherine's careful attention to his meals, and began experiencing dizzy spells that left him unable to work effectively. By November, he was too weak to return to the mines, surviving on Samuel's income and the small savings the brothers had accumulated over years of careful living. Catherine nursed Thomas with the devotion expected of a new wife, spending her days preparing special foods to tempt his diminished appetite, and her nights sitting beside his bed when coughing, fits prevented sleep. She consulted with other women about home remedies, traded sewing work for medicinal herbs, and maintained the household despite the additional burden of caring for an invalid husband. Samuel, meanwhile, seemed energized by his brother's illness. His illegal enterprises expanded dramatically, bringing in more money than the family had ever seen. He hired additional men to help with liquor production and distribution, established new routes for avoiding federal agents, and began accumulating wealth with the focused intensity of a man preparing for significant change. The neighbors who still maintained relationships with the Sullivan family noted the contrast between the brothers' conditions with growing unease. Thomas grew weaker each week, his robust miner's physique wasting away until his clothes hung loose on his frame. Samuel grew more prosperous and confident, his business success allowing him to purchase better clothing, improve his appearance, and project the kind of assured competence that attracted both customers and admirers. But it was the change in Catherine that most disturbed those few women who still visited the Sullivan cabin to check on Thomas's condition. The withdrawn, melancholy woman of late summer had been replaced by someone more vibrant and purposeful. She moved through the cabin with renewed energy, spoke with greater confidence, and seemed to glow with an inner light that made her more beautiful than ever. When asked about her transformation, Catherine attributed it to the satisfaction of caring for her husband and the security that Samuel's business success provided for the family. But observant women noticed that her renewed vitality seemed inversely related to Thomas's declining health, as if she drew strength from his weakness. By December, when snow began falling in earnest and the mining community settled into winter hibernation, Thomas Sullivan was barely strong enough to leave his bed. The robust man who had once worked the most dangerous shifts in the county had become a pale shadow, dependent on his wife and brother for the most basic needs. And Samuel Sullivan, the restless younger brother who had once lived in Thomas's shadow, had become the undisputed head of the household, making decisions about money, medicine, and the family's future with the authority of a man who expected to be obeyed. The transformation was complete. What remained was for someone to ask the right questions about how it had happened so quickly, and why Catherine and Samuel seemed so remarkably prepared for their new roles. The brothers who shared one wife, final sections, dark chapters, buried truths of American history. Thomas Sullivan died on February 14, 1935, exactly 1 year after Catherine had first walked down the main street of their settlement. He passed during the night, his weakened body finally surrendering to whatever illness had consumed him through the winter months. Catherine discovered his body at dawn, her screams echoing across the frozen hollow and bringing neighbors running through knee-deep snow. The funeral was small, attended by the few community members who still maintained relationships with the Sullivan family. Samuel delivered a eulogy that brought tears to many eyes, speaking of his brother's strength, integrity, and devotion to family. Catherine wept appropriately, accepting condolences with the dignity expected of a grieving widow. But even as Thomas's body was lowered into the frozen ground of the mountain cemetery, whispers had already begun about the unseemly haste with which certain arrangements were being made. Samuel filed papers to inherit his brother's share of the family property within a week of the funeral, claiming partnership agreements that predated Thomas's marriage. Catherine, as the legal widow, contested these claims, arguing that Thomas's assets should pass to her under state law. The dispute required county court intervention, bringing lawyers from Harlan and Barberville to examine the Sullivan family's affairs with the kind of scrutiny they had never faced before. It was during these legal proceedings that Dr. Harold Messick, a physician from Lexington who had been hired to provide expert testimony about mining-related health conditions, examined Thomas's medical history and raised questions that no one had thought to ask while he was alive. Dr. Messick's testimony, preserved in the court records that would later be sealed, was devastating in its clinical precision. Thomas's symptoms, the doctor explained, were consistent not with the lung diseases common among coal miners, but with chronic poisoning by arsenic or similar metallic compounds. The progression of his illness, the specific nature of his physical deterioration, and the timeline of his decline all pointed to deliberate, sustained exposure to toxic substances over a period of several months. Under oath, Catherine was asked to account for Thomas's care during his final illness. Her testimony, delivered with apparent confidence, detailed the special meals she had prepared, the medicines she had administered, and the devoted attention she had provided throughout his decline. But under cross-examination, her story began to develop inconsistencies that made the court stenographer stop typing and look up in surprise. Catherine spoke of treatments she had given Thomas in September, then corrected herself to say August, then changed her statement again to claim she couldn't remember specific dates. She described medicines Samuel had purchased for his brother, then insisted she had obtained them herself, then claimed Dr. Messick was mistaken about their importance. Most damaging of all, when asked to describe conversations with Thomas during his final weeks, she repeatedly confused which brother she was discussing, referring to his plans and his concerns in ways that made it unclear whether she meant her dying husband or his increasingly prosperous brother. The breakthrough came when James McCready, the general store owner, was called to testify about purchases made by the Sullivan family during Thomas's illness. McCready's meticulous records showed that Samuel had bought unusual quantities of rat poison containing arsenic compounds, claiming he needed them for his bootlegging operation to keep vermin away from grain stores. The purchases coincided precisely with the timeline of Thomas's declining health. But it was the testimony of Walter Kinsey, a miner who had worked alongside both Sullivan brothers, that sealed their fate. Kinsey told the court that 3 weeks before Thomas's death, he had discovered Samuel and Catherine together in the back room of the Sullivan cabin, arguing in whispers over a handwritten document that appeared to be a will. When they noticed his presence, both had acted startled and guilty, hastily hiding the papers and insisting they were merely discussing household finances. Under intense questioning, Kinsey admitted he had returned later that night and observed the cabin from the woods, watching through the uncurtained kitchen window as Samuel and Catherine sat at the table, their heads close together, examining what appeared to be legal documents while Thomas lay unconscious in the next room. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts for both Catherine and Samuel on charges of conspiracy to commit murder. The evidence was circumstantial but overwhelming. The suspicious poisoning, the premature inheritance dispute, the witness testimony about their intimate relationship, and their own contradictory statements under oath. Samuel was sentenced to life imprisonment, Catherine to 20 years with possibility of parole. Both appealed their convictions, and both had their sentences reduced through legal maneuvering that reflected the era's reluctance to execute a woman and the general belief that Samuel had been the plan's architect rather than its mere participant. But justice, such as it was, proved irrelevant to their ultimate fate. Samuel died in the state penitentiary in 1937, killed in a fight with another prisoner who had learned about his crime and decided that men who poisoned their own brothers deserved special punishment. Catherine survived until 1939, dying of tuberculosis in the women's prison in Louisville, her beauty and intelligence finally consumed by the institution's harsh conditions. They were buried in the same cemetery where Thomas lay, but on opposite sides of the hill, separated in death as they had been joined in conspiracy. The old Sullivan cabin was abandoned, its roof collapsing under the weight of mountain winters and community shame. But some say the story didn't end with their deaths. Local residents claim that on certain cold nights, when the wind moves through the hollow just right, you can still see lamplight in the windows of the ruined cabin. Three voices carry on the mountain air, raised in argument about things that can never be resolved: love, loyalty, betrayal, and the terrible price of wanting what was never meant to be yours. In the hills of eastern Kentucky, blood binds families tighter than law, but it can also curse them beyond redemption. The court records are dry ink on brittle paper now, filed away in basement archives where few will ever read them. But between those formal lines lies a truth the mountains never forgot. Some unions are forged in sin and sealed in the grave. The Sullivan brothers shared everything in life: their father's land, their mother's Bible, their reputation in the coal camps. In the end, they shared a woman who destroyed them both, and a legacy that reminds us that the most horrifying truths are often hidden in plain sight, disguised as love, masked as family loyalty, and buried so deep that it takes a century for the whole story to claw its way back to the surface. Some secrets are worth keeping, others are too dangerous to let lie. This was both.